Hi, I'm Craig Smith, a former New York Times correspondent and host of the podcast Eye on AI. I'm also a special government employee at the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. And in this role, I'm serving as the host for NSCAI's podcast series on the Commission's work. At the beginning of March this year, the Commission issued its final report to the President and Congress outlining its recommended strategy for winning in the artificial intelligence era. This week, I spoke to NSCAI staff Aristotle, Vainikos, and Parker Wild about the Commission's recommendations for establishing public-private innovation hubs around the country that can expand the participation of private enterprise in national security. I hope you find the conversation as surprising as I did. Let's start, Aristotle, by you introducing yourself and telling us about what you've been doing at the National Security Commission on AI and about the recommendations that you've worked on regarding public-private partnerships.
I'm Aristotle Vainikos. I'm an intern with the National Security Commission on AI. I've been focusing on recommendations to accelerate domestic innovation.
And Parker, could you introduce yourself?
My name is Parker Wild, and I'm a fellow with the National Security Commission on AI, and I work with the Line of Effort 4, which focuses on technology protection, computer hardware, and associated technologies.
We've identified on the Commission a couple of trends in the development of artificial intelligence and other strategic technologies that are worrying for the future of U.S. leadership. So number one, there's a heavy concentration of talent and resources in the private sector. That means that those are the companies and researchers that are setting the conditions for where AI will head next. Sometimes that's not conducive to the national security use cases that the government is interested in. And then second, we've seen this geographic concentration of companies and experts in regions like Silicon Valley. Now, this is excellent. We think that clustering encourages competition and creates collisions between companies and other researchers. But there are other cities and regions across the US with burgeoning tech industries that are simply not being accessed by the government and other relevant entities who would drive domestic innovation. So because of that, the Commission has recognized that regional innovation is an important driver of economic competitiveness in these strategic technologies, and that it's going to require some effort by the federal government to facilitate these collaborations and work to create really a whole of nation effort to develop and research these strategic technologies and then move them into products that are both applicable to the commercial sector and to the national security needs that we have as a nation. All of that leads us to recommend a network of regional innovation clusters that would exist throughout the nation. We recommend at least 10 of them and would bring these companies, researchers, academics, nonprofits, and the federal government together in dense areas of innovation and access to resources that is going to help us create the next generation of AI technologies.
There is a movement away from the coast, not only by technologists or entrepreneurs, but by venture capital into hubs across the United States. And generally, I've talked to VCs about this. They look for towns that have a research university and some local capital to get angel and seed stage companies started, and then maybe a large industry to provide a market or personnel. How does the government propose identifying regions for this kind of center?
That's a really good question, Craig. One of the things that the Commission is very aware of is that we don't want to be prescriptive in where these clusters are located or what subject they're focused on. And that comes from our engagement with industry and also with government stakeholders like the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who have experience in this sort of thing in the past. Not sure if you're aware of a program called Manufacturing USA, but that's a program office run out of the National Institute of Standards and Technology that creates these types of clusters or hubs around manufacturing centers in the United States. And they coordinate collaboration between industry and academia, and their goal is to create strong industry growth in those areas. And it might be around photonics, it might be around some kind of auto manufacturing. To answer your question, we think the best way for these regional innovation clusters to be located and for their subject to be decided upon is for this program office, which we recommend establishing in NIST. It'll be an interagency program office, but it would be located at NIST, to create a competitive bid process. So what they would do is they would issue a solicitation for bids from groups of industry consortia, their academic partners, state and local governments, and they would come up with proposals for clusters in a specific area of industry that align with our definition of these strategic industries. So Aristotle mentioned earlier, this includes AI, it could include quantum computing, other areas like biotechnology, advanced manufacturing, energy systems. Those technologies we've identified in Chapter 16 of our final report, if you'd like to see more detail on that. But the consortia would present their recommendation or their proposal for what they want to focus on, and then they'd submit this to the program office, and the program office would assess these based on their validity and whether or not they believe industry will be successful in creating these clusters. And when they do that, they'll then issue grants. If they think industry will be successful, they'll issue grants to support the growth of the clusters, ideally in a way that's distributed across the country. So it's not just located on the coast, like we were saying.
So it's really the industry consortium or consortia that will propose locations as well as subject areas. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And again, this just goes back to the idea that the government is not trying to pick winners. It hasn't had success in doing that in the past, but really this is an amplification mechanism for industry and their academic partners. So the goal is to just grow clusters that have a nascent foundation already.
And the Competitiveness Consortium, is this a collection of these industry consortia that you're talking about?
So that's a different entity, which we're happy to talk about. The regional innovation clusters we see as being part of a network. Our initial recommendation is to fund the National Program Office at $5 million a year, and they will issue these bids, and then they'll designate around a dozen, 10 to 12 regional innovation clusters, and they'll make up this network. The Private Sector Competitiveness Consortium is a different entity. It's more aimed directly at the private sector without a government partner. One of the things that Commission recognizes is that the development of AI requires public-private partnership, but it also requires a shared sense of responsibility by the private sector as well for U.S. competitiveness globally and also the well-being of the U.S. tech industry and all Americans. The Competitiveness Consortium is a call on industry to create a nonprofit organization with about $1 billion of funding over 5 years with the goal of broadening AI research opportunities and then support for skills and education. So teaching the American workforce the skills they need to participate in the digital economy, essentially.
But funded by the government?
No, actually, the Commission challenges private sector to establish themselves as a corporate responsibility action.
And fund it privately from the members of the consortium.
Yeah, that's correct.
And this coordination office, at NIST. You said it would be funded according to the recommendations with $5 million a year. Is it that $5 million then that would fund the grants to regional consortia that would form these centers?
I can answer this, and then Aristotle, you can add on, because I know you've thought a lot about this, but the $5 million is not for the issuing grants. The $5 million is designed to stand up the program office, to staff it, and then allow it to carry out its first duty, which is identifying and designating these clusters. The funding itself, we don't have specific legislative language for, but we do set a goal. The goal is for the program office to identify exactly what kind of funding these need. More of a case-by-case basis, you can imagine. Some sectors may need more funding than others, but our thought is that these clusters should receive round about $20 million a year in federal support that's matched at least 1-to-1 by private sector supports. And this number comes from the Manufacturing USA support levels. So that's our yardstick. Aristotle, you have anything to add on that?
The only thing to add is perhaps what this funding is going toward. So I'll first echo what Parker said. This can't just be federally funded. The government has a role to play as a catalyst, but it's essential that we also have financial participation from the private sector and from state and local governments. So all of that will come together to give us that amount of about $50 million each year. The funding will go toward lots of different initiatives at the clusters. So part of it will go to the technology research centers that we talked about earlier. These entities that house government researchers and program managers are also writing contracts for technologies that are coming out of these clusters and seem to have promise for U.S. national security. They're also funding research grants themselves at the TRCs and throughout the regional innovation cluster community. So much of the funding is being channeled through those TRCs. And then the rest is for supporting infrastructure. The regional innovation clusters cannot exist without adequate access to data sets, test beds, other government research facilities. These supporting entities are critical for decreasing that barrier to access for startups and other companies that have these great ideas for technologies, but then need these sorts of sandboxes to play with them and implement them. So the money is also going toward really supporting the regional innovation cluster through the infrastructure that's essential for research as well.
But that doesn't exclude the coast. There would be a center in or around Silicon Valley. There would be a center in Boston and New York, presumably. Am I right?
It certainly doesn't exclude the coasts, no. As Parker touched on a little bit earlier, the commission was not intending to be prescriptive in where the clusters would be established. We think the program office settled at NIST would be adequately resourced to read these competitive bids and then decide on which places have the most economic feasibility. But this is really about identifying those locations throughout the US that have latent innovation potential. Where is there that budding startup sector that the US government simply hasn't been able to either support properly or tap into for national security benefit? We see it with quantum technology, for example. There are few academic institutions and research entities that are at the leading edge of quantum technologies, and these are in some very niche pockets throughout the nation. We have to be able to find those cells and then tap into the talent there. So whether that's at Silicon Valley or the Midwest, the commission hopes that those areas would submit bids to the program office at NIST and that talent would be identified. I will add that there are groups in the government right now doing good work to try to access, especially some of the places you mentioned, Craig, Silicon Valley, Boston, et cetera. These are things like the Army's Open Campus Initiative and Naval X, which are starting to realize that this regional approach to innovation is critical. So the work is happening. This recommendation is really talking about now these regional economies and hitting more of the nation.
The mission sounds similar to DARPA or ARPA, maybe even Defense Innovation Unit. In what ways will this differ?
Yeah, excellent question. So those entities that you brought up, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, Defense Innovation Unit, I think that's a great example. These are small in terms of mission scope, that are looking to access the talent where it exists, Silicon Valley, elsewhere in the nation, and really working to channel successful research that's already being done into these strategic use cases that would be beneficial for the US national interest. The regional innovation clusters, take the spirit of this approach of trying to identify the best research happening across the nation and nurture it so that it can create national security benefit, but then really amplifies the scope. We're talking about not only creating these national security programs of record, but also supporting US economic competitiveness more broadly. That's why they're located throughout the nation, the regional innovation clusters. And that's why they're not only focused on that last step of taking existing commercial off-the-shelf technologies and pulling them into government use cases, but also working to support the entire lifeline of development, from basic research to iterative prototyping and then deployment.
These are recommendations being made by the National Security Commission on AI, but they are broader than national security and certainly broader than AI. Why did the Commission feel it necessary to make such broad recommendations outside its original scope?
The Commission in its interim report said that it was going to look at ways to amplify regional innovation as a way for increasing U.S. competitiveness in strategic technologies. And the way that our recommendation on regional innovation clusters is currently written is that they should be focused on areas of the economy that are both important to the U.S. economic competitiveness and also to its national security. The reason that AI is important is not only because it has direct national security use cases, but also that it makes the United States economically competitive on a global scale. And the last chapter of our report, chapter 16, is on associated technologies. Congress mandated the Commission to take a look beyond AI. It would be doing a disservice to the future when a new emerging technology comes up that is critical to U.S. national security and U.S. economic competitiveness, whether it be quantum computing or biotech. So the reason we have a broader scope here is because we think it's important to look into the future and prepare for what's going to affect the United States national security in conjunction with AI. And all these things they're interconnected.
And the NIST office would depend on legislative appropriations, I presume, or some legislative action. The Competitiveness Consortium would rely on an industry initiative. I can see industry responding once there is money available through the NIST office to set up regional hubs. But how do you get the Competitiveness Consortium going? That's not something that Congress can mandate.
So that's a good question. And just to briefly touch on your first point, you're right that the Regional Innovation Cluster Network would require legislation and appropriations, and we've drafted legislative language to that effect. To the Competitiveness Consortium, I think what the Commission is trying to make clear to all of its readers, from industry and government alike, is that to maintain U.S. competitiveness in technologies like AI, it requires a whole of nation approach. The government needs to take responsibility, but so does the private sector. And in this case in particular, the Competitiveness Consortium is calling for supporting the growth in AI skills and education in the workforce. Industry has many initiatives like this already, but the Commission believes that this is something that would help industry as well as the nation more broadly become more skilled in technologies like AI. Industry is currently facing a skills shortage in technologies like AI. And if they want to continue to grow and to be globally competitive, they need to build this base of talent.
Some of these collaborations already exist related to national security. And so we don't think it's a huge step to call on industry once more to really consolidate efforts and think about how it can pool resources for mutual benefit. We've heard a positive reception to this idea. The Commission has engaged with stakeholders from across sectors, and there's generally an understanding that the US government can't go it alone when it comes to accelerating our national economic competitiveness. And some of our corporations, which are already well suited to create the AI and other technology breakthroughs of the future, can also step up and really create the pipelines of talent, resources, et cetera, that are going to benefit them and the nation more broadly.
On the NIST office, the $5 million a year, and then subsequent funding for the regional centers, what piece of legislation should people watch to see if that becomes a reality?
One of the pieces of legislation that this idea draws from, and also the legislative language that we put forward, is the Endless Frontier Act, which is a bill that was introduced in the Senate by Senator Schumer. So there's been a lot of talk about that progressing in one way or another, but ultimately I'm not exactly sure how it would crop up.
In many places in the report, the legislative language that's been drafted is designed to drop directly into a particular piece of legislation like the National Defense Authorization Act. But in this case, it's a language that could be dropped into any legislation touching on something related.
Yeah, I think you're right. And obviously the scope of this recommendation is maybe a little broader than some of our other recommendations, where the obvious place for them to land is in the NDAA. But I do think this could go in other places.
And because this certainly will get the attention of the regional hubs that are growing and trying to attract national attention. A lot of them are struggling to attract attention from the coasts where the money is concentrated. Is there anything that individual startups or accelerators or incubators or venture capitalists in these regional hubs can do to raise awareness or attract attention as this hopefully moves into actuality?
The answer to that is yes. As we noted earlier, this is really an effort to identify the places that already have nascent ecosystems of growth. And so that might imply that the competitive bid process would work to identify these locations and then move ahead that way. But there are also ways that locations can work to amplify their profile in terms of how promising they would be as regional innovation clusters. We mentioned before, the access to resources and facilities. This is something that state and local governments can work to grow within their regions in order to check another box for what they might be submitting for the program office's consideration. The Commission recommends that the program office be looking for these places that have a commitment to growth and the beginnings of a foundation of resources with which to get there.
One thing that we talk about in our recommendation is creating a package of incentives that would allow industry and academia to draw them into these clusters. One thing in particular we think is important is that state and local policies are in line and amplify the federal policies. So we call out having obviously research grants, but also maybe loan guarantees, seed funding, and then investment tax credits to draw people to these regions. And we think that with a portfolio approach, we can get capital into these areas that demonstrate potential, like Aristotle was saying. So the goal is really to promote investment in other regions in the country.
That's it for this week's podcast. I want to thank Aristotle and Parker for their time. I encourage everyone who cares about the future of our world to read the National Security Commission on AI report, which can be found at www.nscai.gov. Regardless of how you feel about military uses of AI, It's critical that people involved in the field understand what the government is doing. The singularity may not be near, but AI is changing your world, so pay attention.